We have microphones on the left and the right, so if you start and raise your hand, we'll be glad to get started with questions for Mark.
Why do we have all this ferment now? Is it that different peoples are protesting against different things and it just kind of all comes together now? What's your view on that?
I think that's part of it, that essentially you have, and I tried to demonstrate what a wide spectrum of different causes these folks have. Essentially there are just a kind of confluence of different challenges, different problems, people angry about different things. I would also say probably as well, some of the same reasons that you see for electoral ferment here too. A sort of chronically slow economy over the last several decades, not a lot of dynamic growth, kind of a middle class squeeze. I think some of these same issues that are here, along with a wide panoply of others, that essentially you have, separatist issues and these rise of these kind of nativist governments, and you have resentment of Brussels and sort of the overarching nature of the EU, too intrusive for a lot of people. So I think it's a combination of sort of separate reasons and then some sort of shared threads.
Yeah. Question in the back over there on the right. Jerry?
This is a crazy off-the-wall question, so you're entitled to dismiss it as a crazy off-the-wall question, but maybe international political scientists would look at the discussion of what's going on in the European Union and try to think about who benefits and who is harmed by the developments there. And as I think about the last year or two, it seems one of the greatest strains being placed on the European Union is the immigrant flow from Syria. Let's pretend that Russia would find it attractive to stir the pot in the EU and weaken the EU as a unit. And let's suppose that Russia could develop its policy towards Syria with that sort of thing in mind. Is there any rationale to that?
Yeah, I don't think you're entirely wrong there. I think, in fact, one of the things that Germany right now is upset about is that Russian state TV has been essentially building up some of these immigrant issues, sexual assaults and so forth. And they're actually charged some reporters with incitement. And again, the Russians would probably view this as turnabout as fair play. I mean, you finance political parties and other people in Ukraine who are hostile to us. You finance people like Navalny that are essentially trying to get rid of our government, not with a whole lot of success. I don't think Putin is going anywhere. But essentially the Russians are there, aha, okay, you put sanctions on us, you've tried to stir up trouble for us, we'll try to stir up trouble for you. I think they also have, some other reasons. Assad's been a long-time ally, he's bought a lot of Russian weapons, he hosts a Russian naval base, which is their only one in the Mediterranean, so they have a lot of reasons. They're also just, okay, there's been a lot of interventions in the Middle East by the United States, overthrowing governments that were, if not necessarily our allies, at least not unfriendly to us. The Libyan case was, I think, a major case, major point in Russia's evolution toward a more hostile policy. Remember, Medvedev originally went along with that. Said, okay, we'll stand back. We will not oppose this resolution in the Security Council as long as you safeguard our interests. Well, Gaddafi's overthrown. The originally pro-U.S. government is put in before it lapsed into total chaos. And immediately, Russian economic interests as well as Chinese were immediately expelled. So at this point, the Russians said, aha, well, okay, this is the way you want to do it. We can play that way too. And so I think you're actually right. I think they do stir this up. And it's probably in many ways a additional little benefit for them. And they've allowed refugees to go through Russia into Norway. as well, which is something a lot of people don't know. It's kind of an alternative path, and there has been some of the Scandinavian countries and Norwegians say they're doing this on purpose. They're sending these people in to burden us and destabilize us, and I don't think they're necessarily wrong. I think there's a sort of, again, any way now that these West and Russia become very hostile to one another, the West will find what it can do to try to harm Russia, and Russia will find what it can do to try to harm the West.
I find it interesting, your examples of France and Britain, as the rise of the native nationalist parties or movements were impacting the existing two-party system, pushing the two parties in France into an unholy alliance.
Yeah.
And then in Britain, it was really the Scottish National Party
Yep.
that really wiped the British Labour Party.
Already out. Yeah.
So is there a lesson there for us, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, you can see some definite parallels there. Obviously, in Britain, Labour now has become really morbid and really weak. And you can perhaps start to see the outlines of something like that happening here with the current splits in the Democratic Party. And I would also note that one of the things that hit Labour is they have a dearth of charismatic leaders. And if you look, and again, my opinion here, and feel free to differ with me, but if you look at the Democrats today, you've got Bernie Sanders, who has got a very devoted following, but he's a socialist, which isn't going to fly here long-term electorally. He's still a niche candidate, very strong niche candidate, but a niche candidate. If you look at Hillary Clinton, you have a very uninspiring, unappealing figure who, if she's matched up, say, against Marco Rubio in the fall, is going to get slaughtered. I mean, going to get slaughtered. You look at Rubio and you see a guy who could be another Reagan. I mean, he's got that kind of charisma. Now, he's got to get by Donald Trump. That's his issue. But you could see him becoming, like a David Cameron in Great Britain or a Boris Johnson in Great Britain, a really dominant figure, really shifting to the right. And you can argue, look at this election. Look at the energy on the Republican side. Look at the turnouts. Look at the lack of turnout. Look at the lack of energy. Look at the lack of inspiration on the Democratic side. And you see, I mean, Britain and the U.S. often kind of have this reflection of one another. Thatcher presages Reagan. Clinton presages Blair. The shift in the dominance to the right in Great Britain could well, look, Republicans have the Senate. They have the House. If I were a betting man right now, I'd say Marco Rubio is going to be the next president of the United States. They'll have the presidency. That's a big shift, right? So essentially, you could see that as a potential parallel. In France, it's just weird because you have the socialists literally withdrawing their candidates. Again, it shows how moribund the left is in the West right now. That Hollande is so unpopular. France's economy is doing so badly. They're just waiting to vote him out of office, basically. And again, you can see that the socialists were the ones that withdrew their candidates, not the Republicans, not the conservatives. So again, there's this clear shift to the right in the West that looks like it could be quite an important trend.
Yeah, I'll stick with my original question, although you phrased a lot.
Yeah, intentionally. I'm trying to be provocative.
But I was just going to follow up on the immigration thing, and I didn't know about the immigrants going through Russia over to Norway,
Yep.
which is interesting. But my question before you said that was going to be, Russia's facing a declining population. Why aren't they, or are they, accepting immigrants with open hands?
A couple things. One, they reversed that, really to quite a degree. Now, I haven't seen the latest stats since the economic downturn hit, which is, partially sanctions related, but it's mostly the oil prices. Sanctions really, honestly, haven't been all that effective. It's the drop in the oil price. Now, I haven't seen the numbers to see if birth rate crashed again, but Putin got that up. I mean, he paid people to have kids, essentially. And the birth rate now is much better than Germany's, for example. Now, again, I haven't seen whether there's been another statistical downturn. So they're not having as many problems. And Russia has been a huge in-migration country. It has accepted a lot of immigrants. It also has tons of illegal immigrants. I think the second most in the world after the U.S. That has caused serious resentments there, as it has obviously here, if you look at somebody like Donald Trump. And that's why I mentioned at the end, The nativists are the people that are against Putin. The nativist nationalists, people like Navalny, for example, refer to these immigrants as cockroaches, rodents, other interesting choice terms. Putin does not play that card, in part because I think he, like most sort of business-friendly governments, big business likes the cheap labor, and so therefore it's good to have those folks come in. And then also, I think for a long time since the birth rate was low, there was some of the reasons you mentioned. That birth rate has become somewhat more stabilized now, and as a result of that economy too, Putin is reversing course a little bit, and he's being a little tougher in terms of letting people in, probably again, worried about losing support politically with the lower middle class and working class.
The longevity is still very low, isn't it? Or has
It's
it
improved too. It's improved too. President Obama made a comment about that recently that was completely wrong. He said that it's 53. That was under Boris Yeltsin. Under Yeltsin, it dipped that low. Average male longevity went to 53. Putin again got that up now into the low 60s, and again until the current economic downturn was hit. And it's too recent to see what the demographic impact of that is. But he had improved that quite a bit, and it was under Yeltsin that the rate really dropped. Other questions?
I realize that our primary concern is nationalism, the nation state, and separatist movements within it. But it seems to me that this can go to smaller units that identify with a cultural group and so forth.
Oh, yeah.
And you talked about Libya a little bit ago. There are obviously several different separatist groups there. They sort of join and then they split and so forth. In Russia, the Chechen separatist movement, it itself is divided there. And then of course take the classic example, I guess, would be Syria, where so many different groups are separating and then reuniting and then separating again.
Right.
It depends upon what day you're reading the news, what group is separating from what. So it seems to me like that aspect of this whole problem of what group, what cultural group, what identity, not just national identity, but identity at a small cultural, historical group.
Right. That essentially, you could argue that in part, perhaps, because of new technology and because of greater connectiveness, that in some sense there's this sharper sense of identity. There's also in a number of countries around the world that are receiving immigrants, there's this sense that immigrants no longer assimilate, right? That there's this stronger sense of who are we and how are we different than this culture that we're moving toward, and that we want to retain a part of our own culture even though we've now moved somewhere else. And whether or not that's accurate, or whether that's simply a perception that's perhaps an error, who knows? But again, in many of these European countries, particularly with Islamic immigrants, there is this broad complaint that essentially these folks move here and then they don't become like us, right? They essentially import their culture, their values, which are very different than ours, right? Very different than ours. And so this has led to a lot of resistance to this. Now, again, you can argue from another point of view that this is, xenophobic, racist. A lot of these terms are thrown at a lot of these nationalist groups. And one can certainly argue that they're to some degree accurate. But on the other hand, you don't want to totally dismiss, the claims that these groups make, because there's a pretty broad perception of this. Again, I'm not trying to choose sides here in some sense. But certainly the EU has. And the EU's coming down and basically said, look, these are xenophobic, racist groups. We are tolerant. We are multicultural. And again, you can see some of the same echo of what's going on currently in the United States with the debate over political correctness, multiculturalism, immigration. That there's this same sense of groups coming in, having a sort of sharper, more defined, more established identity, and then not adopting the identity of the country they're moving toward, or at least that's the perception. Other questions?
As a Scandinavian American, and after having read correspondence with some translation from the Scandinavian countries about looking down on us a bit for all of our problems over here, our race riots, our murder rates, our ghettos in the cities and so on, and they were saying, what's wrong with you guys?
Yeah.
But they forget that they've been a homogeneous society for
Yep.
over 1,000+ years, and there's a little schadenfreude in me that I would kind of say, I'm thinking to myself, how's it feel?
Yeah. Yeah, and I didn't get into the Scandinavian countries, but they're having a lot of these same problems. They're having a lot of groups that are opposed to immigration, again, particularly from the Middle East. The Swedes have taken a ton of people in from places like Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and again, that's caused a lot of resentment there. The Norwegians are another state that has taken in a lot of these immigrants. And now, actually, some of these Scandinavian countries are moving to send them back. Essentially, the Norwegians essentially now are trying to push some of these people back across the Russian border. Of course, the Russians don't want them either. Where are you going to send them at some point? And again, a lot of the European countries, who are, a number of whom, joined in the condemnation, for example, of Orban in Hungary, who built that wall. Now there's a lot of them saying, when are we going to build ours? We want to do this too. And Merkel, of course, has been the main force in not allowing a lot of them to do that because the Germans carry so much weight in the EU. But now even she's under pressure, particularly because of what happened in Cologne, which is, again, another one of those cases of this cultural clash. And even she's under pressure now about, how many of these folks are you going to take? And so if Germany starts kind of waffling and maybe sending some people home, then these other states are going to say, oh, come on, and you expect us to take these people? Really? Economically troubled states in Southern Europe, poor countries in Eastern Europe, we're supposed to absorb this burden, and you aren't, Germans? So essentially, I think those, the Scandinavians are, in some sense, learning what it's like, right? They have had this, a lot of these European countries have been very homogenous, and now suddenly, not so much anymore. Other questions?
Some of the conditions that Cameron identified struck you as being a bit protectionist.
Mm-hmm.
Does the World Trade Organization constraints limit the extent to which those kind of things can be actually implemented without...
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that some of them struck me, maybe not so much as protectionist, but as more assertive in terms of Britain's rights within the continent. That the British obviously feel they're more competitive, and that the EU bureaucracy is getting in the way of allowing them into, we want a real single economic space, very laissez-faire, and we want to include these other trade deals. Then the question is, where does the WTO apply in this? The other thing is you can sue people before the WTO all day long, and then enforcing it's a whole other thing. So I think, again, because these cases get tied up for years and years and years in these trade disputes. So again, he's saying essentially, we want more British access, but at the same time, we want to be sure that we are not discriminated against because we want to keep the pound. And this is something the British have long feared, that essentially their decision to stay off the euro will expose them to various direct and indirect forms of economic discrimination from Europe. But again, the WTO may well have, on a number of these things, have something to say. But again, he claims, look, I've got this, I've got 28-nation agreement, so therefore, if everybody's agreed, you would assume that nobody brings a case before the WTO. But would one dissatisfied country do so? Who knows? Good question.
Excuse me.
I heard the gentleman talk about they haven't become like us.
Oh, excuse me. Yeah, they haven't become like us. The colonial nations in Europe have had immigration since their colonies were established. What's new?
Yeah,
Germany imported Turkish workers and put trains to bring them and take them back. What's new? We've had people crossing our border since I was born. And I went back and forth across that same border. And I remember growing up as a child in the Southwest, signs in the restaurant that says, "We don't feed dogs and Mexicans here." Those signs haven't changed. They've taken them out.
Right.
The people who put the signs there,
Still think the same way.
and they educate their children. So what's new?
You could argue that a lot of this isn't new, and you certainly could say, I mean, there was a lot of resentment over the Turks that were being brought in Germany, for example. I mean, you know, I did think of a lot of pretty racist jokes that I heard about Turks when I was in Germany decades ago now. So I would say a lot of it isn't new. Perhaps what gives it this extra virulence today, I would argue both in the United States and in Europe, is this fact that over the last 20 years, there really hasn't been the kind of traditional progress economically that the West has seen. I mean, if American wages and Europeans' wage patterns aren't terribly different, in fact, theirs are worse. That really over the last 16, 17 years, we've seen really very little growth in real wages. There's this sense of people are stagnated, that they're having to work harder, they're either falling behind or having to work harder to stay in place. In the U.S., you have now, I saw a statistic the other day that just, it surprised me, but maybe not so much, that 2/3 of the population has basically no savings. They don't have $500 in a saving account. And again, you can see some of this same middle-class squeeze going on in Europe. And when that stuff happens, people start looking around. And whether rightly or wrongly, they look right, who's to blame and who's sitting there, right?
Who looks different?
Who looks different? I think that's definitely part of it. Yeah.
I'm struck by your earlier quote that thinking about the future of Europe, that it would descend perhaps into something far less clear,
Yeah.
that we would have an economic union of sorts, but no political union.
Right.
And as I think about these different issues being raised, I'd like to throw a metaphor at you and see what you think. In feudalism, the principalities ultimately lost their power because the prince formed their allegiance with the freehold mercantilist culture. And if I hear sort of behind the scenes what you're saying, what I haven't heard talked about are these very large economic interests that actually fuel, I mean, we're talking about it as Putin doing this for Russians. Always groups have nationalist identity issues, but what activates them?
Right.
And what is the role of leadership inside countries to manipulate it? What is the role of leadership outside of those countries to manipulate it? And where do these very large transnational economic interests play into this? And I haven't heard that.
Right, and again, I didn't want to get too complex, but I think that's an excellent point. And I think you cannot in any way overlook how important that is. You look at the Germans, for example. And often I think our press sort of oversimplifies the German situation. For example, the Germans are bailing out Greece or bailing out some other impoverished your EU country, or they're accepting all these refugees. They have some really practical reasons for doing this, right? One, they've had this terrible birth rate that they need population for the future if they're going to remain a viable society. Secondly, I don't know who's recently traveled in Central Europe. Anybody? Okay. I would argue, and I've been there in the last decade twice, that there really, in a lot of these countries, there's no real economy on the national level. In the Czech Republic or the Slovak Republic, they're really limited. It's basically a German economy in those countries, right? They own everything. You go from Germany to these countries, it's poorer, it's less clean, but otherwise, nothing's changed. I mean, it's all the same German companies, all the gas stations are the same, everything else is the same. So the German big business, German transnationals, have a huge interest in this. Now, again, they have to essentially play a certain game with the German government. When I was in Germany in 2006, I had some conversations along this line, specifically about BMW. BMW was being pressured by the then German government to keep more jobs in Germany. Essentially, BMW was saying, why? We can go 25 miles over the border to Slovakia and pay a quarter of what we're paying in Germany and pocket the difference. Why in the heck would we want to keep jobs in Germany? The German government said, look, you have to because we say so, essentially. Because we need those voters, we need that support, and if we export all these jobs, we're going to lose that, right? And so therefore, you're going to lose your stability if you don't go along with us. So there's this whole game of leverage, right? And you can see at the beginning with Cameron, too. What's he trying to get? What's he concerned about? What's he essentially promoting? He's promoting British business access to the European continent, making sure that's there. Otherwise, he'd probably leave the EU, right? He's a conservative, he's at least a moderate British nationalist. He's not particularly tied to the EU. He said, we never really liked the whole superstate idea. But we want to preserve that access for our transnational corporations. That's very important. We believe that we're competitive. So I think you've hit a really important point.
I think that was a huge point too.
Yeah.
And I've gone about 100, the discussion has gone about 113 miles from where I wanted to make my point. But
We can go back.
to your prior point, if we were to cast the Arab Spring and everything forward, well, if we were to cast the redrawing of political boundaries at the end of World War II, and carry the last 60, 75 years, just a broad sweep here. If we were to cast all that in the context of what a lot of big thinkers call postmodernism, it's a worldwide denialism that is going on. It may be expressed relatively quietly, actually, like Putin in terms of Russian international relations, but hugely through Africa, the Middle East, now splattered all over the wall in Europe, and reflected most strongly in our current election cycle. I don't see a whole lot of difference, and I picked up on the discussion of a number of the talking heads saying a whole lot of similarity between Senator Sanders and Mr. Trump.
Yep, there's overlap.
And that's what we're all selling in the U.S. politically, and that wraps clear back here. How long has that been going in and on? And back to your point, it's been going on for a long time, and I think it's maybe close to 50, 60 years of denial of being denied what was promised.
Right.
And now it comes down to where are we going to put the people? Where are the jobs?
Yeah, I think that if I could try to sum that up, and I think you took on a very broad question and a lot of different trends. I would say essentially, is globalization working? I mean, that would be the question that I would come out.
Okay, that's a better term, sure.
Yeah, is globalization working? And I think obviously you could argue that in many ways it isn't for a lot of people. It's working very well for elites. It's working very well for transnational corporations. If you look around the world, you see that money, and this is obviously a theme of both Sanders and Trump. More so with Sanders, but it's implied with Trump too. That essentially, you have this rigged game, you have this globalization economy, which just funnels money to this very narrow strata.
It's a world oligarchy.
And that everybody else is working harder for less. And so essentially you have that appeal, that strain, and obviously the people who are often at the hardest hit point of this are these working class and lower middle class people who then of course react virulently to the immigrants because they see the immigrants as coming in and taking their jobs and undercutting their wages. So essentially that's one of the things, and I think it's all tied up with globalization. And I think what a lot of the ferment now is about, you know, what do we do? Do we have a radical change? If so, what does that look like? Or do we continue with some version of the same policies? And there's a lot of people who are not necessarily, you know, really wealthy or in that top 1 or 5 or 10% who still like the stability, like the way things are. My mom is a huge Hillary Clinton supporter. I mean, she, 84-year-old, she doesn't want things to change all that. She has nice retirement, nice pension, good Medicare, you know, had good wages throughout her career, a lot better probably than the next generation of people had. She's fine with that sort of continuity. And so I think there's also this breakdown in terms of, and again, you're seeing this division, particularly with the Democratic Party this time, between younger voters and older voters.
Yeah.
In contrast to what we've been talking about for an hour and a half, what do you make of the fact that apparently this has worked out quite well for Australia for over 3 centuries, and it seems to be doing spectacularly well in Canada?
Yep. Well, I think one of the things there is probably geography, and that both of those societies were traditionally very sparsely populated. And so you literally had, you know, more room to settle, more sort of underutilized resources. And so once you got those populations up to a level where there could be greater, more efficient resource utilization, those economies did quite well. And there was also in some sense, because you know you could argue that there wasn't as defined a core identity in the first place as say in France, that there had been more of a tradition of immigration, that therefore those societies were somewhat more open. In the case of a lot of the European countries, there was a, you know, they were homogenous, as we mentioned with Scandinavia earlier. And then you had this initial wave of colonial migrants from the colonies, and now you have this flood of people with, in many cases, no cultural connection whatsoever to that society. And so therefore that process has been a lot more of a jarring, shocking effect. And much more densely populated countries, obviously around a lot longer. Resources have been much more efficiently utilized. You didn't really need a lot more population except if you're looking at long-term stability. So just simply a more jarring coming together of these two things.
Do any of your colleagues have any theories about the role that the internet could be playing in all of this?
Well, certainly if you look at a number of these European nationalist groups, they have big web presence. So essentially it is something that certainly has helped spread those ideas within Europe. And again, I just think that everybody's so connected, you know, everybody knows very quickly about what's happening. So if there's trouble somewhere, a riot or somewhere, a demonstration, everybody seems to know about it instantly. And you can have an event that breaks out. And for example, the Cologne assaults, the Cologne sexual assaults that night that occurred in Germany. There has been a lot of accusations that effectively Merkel's government tried to cover that up. They tried to cover the extent of it up because they didn't want a backlash against their policy of welcoming these refugees. In past eras, if that, and I'm not judging that that's what they did or did not try to do, I don't know enough specifically about that case to come to a conclusion. But what if they did try to cover it up? In an era without the internet, could they have done it? Probably. Right? In an era with the internet, not so easy.
I have a question here, John.
Could you or someone else here in the audience address the change after Reagan initiated the amnesty such that the population from 1990 to 2000 jumped 300%, and towns like Madison and Lexington and Crete?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that you have, that was 86, right? I think, remembering correctly? So you had that amnesty, and I think if I remember the details of that, he thought he was amnestying about 1 million, and it was really more like 3 million in the end. And obviously that, then there was the rhetoric in that bill to close the border, which of course never happened. So obviously a lot of those towns were really transformed. Again, I live and work in Crete, and I've seen a number of the things that, well, I don't live there anymore, but I work there. And obviously it's a drastically different town, even today, from what it was when I first started working there in 1998. In many ways, you could argue that that has, provided a culture of vibrancy and richness to that town that has been helpful. But I've also met and talked to a lot of residents there and in some other towns who resent a lot of the things that have happened. We look at this and again see wages undercut, see labor coming in and a lot of it illegal and undercutting them, who have not prospered during that time period. And obviously if you look at the politics of all those folks, that's Trump's people right there in many ways. Those are the folks that are supporting him in many instances. So you can see essentially how in one way these towns became more diverse and more multicultural, and that there were opportunities and there was essentially a coming together of labor and industry that was positive, but at the same time there were effects that were undeniable, and there's of course also the issue of culture, right? A lot of people said, look, we had this traditional small town life, we sort of shared it, we had a common language, a common culture, a common outlook, and here come these people that don't share that. And so there is this resentment when you have that happen. Now again, you could call that racism, xenophobia, you could put a lot of different names to it, but I would also say that the folks who feel that way, calling them that is not going to change their minds. And that's why I think one of the reasons that Trump seems so immune to any criticism that gets thrown at him. And the media just bombards him day and night with kind of negative characterizations. It doesn't affect his supporters one bit. I mean, he made that joke about being able to shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and wouldn't lose any votes. I think he probably could do it. I think he could shoot 10 people and not lose any votes. And again, I think it's because of that sense of economic and cultural grievance. And again, David and I were talking before we started, and he said there's this imagined idyllic past, right? That was the way it was. This is the way it should have been, and then here come along all these foreigners and messed everything up.
So the Irish need not apply.
Well, yeah, and you could argue, and again, you could find a lot of analogies in history, to this. But I think why is it peaking now? It's peaking now because I think of this overall slow economy in the developed countries over the last 20 years.
I like the comments that have been made about the economic squeeze and the resistance to change and that sort of thing. But it seems to me that whether you talk about Scotland or Catalonia or Slovakia or Hungary, they're all too small to go it alone.
Yep, oh yeah.
They can never go it alone. They're going to have to be wrapped into some kind of international regime, okay? At the same time that they are frustrated by all of these international connections.
Yep.
But it seems to me some of these movements and some of these protests are more romantic than pragmatic.
Yep.
And they are stuck with international arrangements of one sort or another. And in that sense, they're relatively different from the United States because we have such a huge internal market.
Right.
We are affected relatively less by trade, more than we used to be, but much less than the Germans and the French and others. And so there is a difference here between these European frustrated protests and the still powerful United States.
Right.
And the only other comment I would make is I've been struck by how the British no longer talk about their global white man's burden.
Right.
And how the French have shifted their global civilizing mission. It's no longer a political project. It's, we've got a beautiful language and we want everybody to speak French.
Right.
Power does make a difference.
It does.
And all of these movements we're talking about in all of these countries, they are small and weak, and they are internationally dependent, and there is no way they can get away from some of these international connections. But correct me if I'm wrong in barking up this tree.
Yeah, no, I think you're dead right. I mean, if you're looking at things like Fidesz in Hungary and law and justice, there are definite limits to what they can do. They're definitely having to work within these structures, but they deeply resent those structures at the same time. I mean, you're going to foist gay marriage on us, no way. You're going to force us essentially to open our markets, and then of course we're going to be overwhelmed by these much bigger economies like Germany. You're going to tell us essentially how much dairy we can produce and that sort of thing. So there's a definite kind of push and pull there. And I think in many ways they're trying to push it as far as they possibly can to get as much of what they want. But there are definite limits, and the question is, you know, when do they get pulled back and how hard? And certainly they're not going to be able to break away from the EU on their own. It would have to be some kind of massive breakup of the EU, which I think is unlikely, followed by them forming some other kind of regional association if they would want to break away entirely. But, you know, they're also, I think, trying to get the best deal they can. I mean, why, you know, do you have Fidesz, for example, going, I mean, obviously there's economic interest in Orban cozying up to Putin, but at the same time also he's saying, okay, there's a counterweight, there's some place we can go if you guys get a little too pushy with us. So I think those smaller countries try to carve out as much of a sphere as they can, but I think you're dead right. They're operating within limits that are defined by others. And the U.S. is a completely different case. And we're still the top power in the world. We're not as unchallenged as we used to be, but still the top power.
I'd like to follow through on David's question and hopefully tap into your long experience in Russia. If we assume for a moment that the EU is going to survive in some way economically, for all the reasons that David mentions, the huge internal market we have, the continuing likely power, the same in China, can you foresee a time post-Putin where Russia would actually find it advantageous to be part of the EU?
I would doubt it. I really would doubt it. I think in some sense we've kind of seen what that would look like, in the sense of, you look at Russia in the 90s. You look at a Russia that is no longer a great power, but more of a subject country to the West. It didn't work out in some sense, and I think it left a deep scar on the Russian people. I was in Russia a lot in the 90s, and they came to the conclusion, and I wouldn't agree with this, but they came to the conclusion essentially this was intentional. That essentially the economic suffering that they went through, which was massive, the decline in life expectancy, the horrors that they went through during that period, was intentional. That it was the West basically trying to kill them off. And I think that was a view that by the mid-90s to late 90s was quite prevalent. And I think it was more a result of mismanagement. I think Americans went over there with some very bad ideas and made some very poor decisions and didn't try to tailor a lot of what they were doing to Russian realities and ended up kind of screwing the country up. I think it was more mistakes rather than intentionality, but the Russians mostly by the end saw intentionality. I saw attitudes shift so dramatically. When I was there in '92, it was, how can we copy the United States? How can we learn from you? By 97, 98, it was the polar opposite. And so I think that now you could argue, 30, 40 years down the line when that generation is dead, who knows? But then, you're into a future that's so distant and things move so fast now. But as far as the near future is concerned, I doubt it. What the Russians will try to do is to try to, as Putin puts it, pivot to the east. Make deals with India, make deals with China, and become a technology supplier, try to kind of transition their economy to more of a high-tech one. And you could argue that, at least in the military sphere, they seem to be doing pretty well with that. But to try to get away from the energy dependence that they've had, and then also, of course, to hope for some kind of rebound in energy prices, because obviously if that doesn't happen, it's going to be tough to really make that pivot to the east work.
Returning for a moment to the David Cameron agreement, since the agreement must be unanimously approved by all other members of the European Union, from this distance, it seems to me that it's a much greater mountain to climb to get unanimous EU agreement.
Well, he says he has already. He says he has already. And he's essentially, this is the deal. He says
It was
essentially,
Friday.
yeah, everybody's agreed. So that part's done. It's now up to the British to essentially accept or reject this. But essentially, all the others have said, essentially, we're on board with this. This has now been agreed to by all 28. And whether that perhaps unravels in some way, that I couldn't tell you. But at least as far as what's being stated now, that part of it is over. And it's just simply whether the British accept it or reject it.
But maybe I was erroneous in assuming that some of these nationalist groups within the various European countries could start an internal movement to have a plebiscite
Yep. Oh yeah.
that mirror images the British vote.
Yes, it easily could happen. Easily could happen. And that's obviously, again, one of these problems where you could see the EU becoming something very amorphous. You try to make this concession to keep this country in, and this concession to make this country in, and then country C doesn't like what country A and B got, and we want a concession, the same one or a different one. And at some point, you get to something that is so amorphous that it lacks any real meaning anymore. I could easily see that happening.
It's very reminiscent of the state fair game called whack-a-mole.
Yeah, yep. Yep, I would agree. Any questions? Some great questions, by the way.
Well, please join me in thanking our guests.